Today we're looking at Parsh Vayigash, and if you will, you probably noticed that the reading that Phil started in chapter 44, and that's before our Parsha. We were actually looking at the very last part of last week's Parsha. And this is where Joseph ordered that his goblet be placed in Benjamin's pack as they headed back. Interestingly enough, you'll note that when the brothers of Joseph were accused of having something there, they would reply, let whoever it is that the goblet is found with be put to death. That's in chapter 44, verse number 9. But then it was modified by Joseph to say, well, the one who the goblet is found with will be the slave. And you'll notice something very interesting, that it was Judah that stood up and spoke privately with Joseph. And this is a very important part of this, because some 22 years earlier, it was Judah that actually volunteered the fact that his brother Joseph should be put into slavery into the hands of the Ishmaelites. So we're seeing a change of heart in Judah, and this is a very important part of this Parsha. You see, what God is after is our repentance, where we are living in sin, where we have done wrong, and we've done things in the past wrong. There's nothing you can do about that. You can't go back and change it. But what you can do is come before the Lord and repent of that. In fact, Joseph becomes a type of our Messiah, as I passed out in the handout last Shabbat. So Parsh Vayigash, Vayigash means and, he came near. And the whole Parsha, if you had a chance to read it, would have been Genesis 44:18 all the way to 47:27. We started in chapter 44 because it sets the tone for what was actually going on when Joseph comes and privately comes and talks to, Judah comes and talks to Joseph. Now there was a Haftorah connection, and we always say the reason why the rabbis chose the Haftorah, which in this case was Ezekiel 37:15 through 28, is because in a theme, by either words or by something in the theme of the Haftorah, we can point back to the Torah. What's really interesting, though, is the connection is actually themes of separation, loss, and division that are followed by forgiveness, healing, and reconciliation. Because we see that Joseph does reveal himself in this Parsha to his brothers. Now, if I were the brothers at that time, realizing this brother that they actually sold into slavery is now second in command in Egypt, and literally held their lives in his hand. At Joseph's word, all of them would have been put to death. And yet, Joseph reveals himself as being the brother and offers forgiveness to them. And that's really what we're seeing here in the Haftorah as well. Now, Judah's descendants represent the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Joseph's descendants represent the 10 northern tribes, also called Ephraim, who were later scattered and lost. You remember the Assyrians came in to the northern tribes of Israel before Nebuchadnezzar came and dealt with the southern tribe of Judah and Benjamin. And the prophet Ezekiel foresees the Messianic era because he's pointing ahead, and you'll notice in the context, when the sticks of Judah and Ephraim are brought together, that's going to be during the Messianic reign, because it goes to say in verse 23 about these two, they will never again defile themselves with their idols, their detestable things, or any of their transgressions, but I'll save them from all the places where they have been living and sinning. Now, what did God do? Well, he's going to bring all these Jewish people, all these people from Ephraim and Manasseh, and bring them all back in. They're not going to be two nations anymore. They're going to be one single kingdom. And it says in verse 24, my servant David will be king over them, and all of them will have one shepherd. Well, that's during the Messianic reign, the 1,000-year reign, and that's when the two sticks are going to be brought together as one underneath Messiah. Now, they were all together as one once before. That was during the Solomonic reign. They were all together, and then, of course, Solomon's one son goes ahead and says we're going to put a greater burden on you guys than my dad did. And, of course, Israel left. Now, Israel's been scattered, but some of these tribes are being found out in Africa. There's the B'nai Menashe. They're up in India. Yeah. So we're finding, through genealogy, we're finding some of these lost tribes. May I remind you that when James writes, he writes to the 12 tribes. They're not lost. They're not lost. No, they're not. So God knows where everybody is, and when you get to the book of Revelation, you're going to see in 7 and 14, the 144,000, God knows where every single one are. And so he's going to be bringing everybody back at the time of the day of the Lord, which we're in anticipation of. We should be. Because to us, it's not a day of wrath, because according to Shaul, the Apostle Paul, we're not destined for wrath. The day of wrath is the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord, as we talked about last Shabbat, is the day of battle when the Lord fights Armageddon. I turn toward you if I could. It is a little pain. But anyway, it's the battle of Armageddon. That is coming. We see all these things happening. Russia has a hook in her mouth. And the hook in the mouth, you notice how intimate Russia is with Syria? Yeah. Very intimate. Why? Is because the Lord is putting a hook down there in the mouth of Russia to bring him on down in. And this last battle is headed this way. But after that, it's going to be the Messianic reign. And then all of the Jewish people, all of Israel is going to be brought together under that Messianic reign of Yeshua. I don't see the two sticks united until the time of the Messianic reign. I do see some uniting taking place, but it doesn't mean that it has to be fully done before the Messiah comes. And in fact, I think I made a comment on it a couple Shabbats ago. The temple that's about to be built, the third temple that's going to be erected, is not going to be the temple that Yeshua comes in and comes to. He's going to do something. If you've ever been on the Mount of Olives, you know the Mount of Olives, according to the book of Zechariah, is going to be split when he touches down north and south. So there's going to be a big rift, a valley there. But right across from the Mount of Olives is the Eastern Gate, which is all closed up. So that's going to be literally destroyed. That'll take care of that Muslim cemetery. That'll take care of the blocks. But our Lord is going to come. Can he not bring with him the temple and make it instantly? He could really do that, and that would fulfill what it says in the book of Ezekiel about the temple. When the Lord comes, he's going to come in power and great glory. And then, as we've already talked about a couple of Shabbats ago, it says in Ezekiel 43 that this is where the Lord's glory enters the house through the gate facing east. The Spirit of the Lord takes Ezekiel up, brings him into the inner courtyard, and then the words were spoken to him, "Human being, this is the place for my throne, the place for the soles of my feet, where I will live among the people of Israel forever." So what we see here is the Messianic reign is going to take place out of the temple, and the final temple, the Ezekiel temple, by the way, was measured by Ezekiel, and the dimensions of the measurements here are different than any other preceding temple that existed before it. So this is going to be a whole different temple. It's going to be larger, and it is quite well said. It's going to well extend over the bounds that the current Temple Mount is, meaning to say that we have a whole new thing going on right there during the time of the Messiah's return. So to comprehend Ezekiel's prophecy, the groundwork of history is this, that during the reign of Solomon, Israel, after his death, split into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And while both of these kingdoms sinned, the Judah group that was carted off to Babylon, Daniel, Hananiah, and the others, which we know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ended up going to Babylon. And 70 years later, Israel, or Judah, I should say, came back. This was not so for many that were taken captive by the Assyrians earlier. So idolatry was common between both Israel and Judah, and here's where the Lord is going to cleanse, as it says in the book of Ezekiel, cleanse them of all their idolatry. They will no longer be defiled, as Ezekiel 37:23 says. They're not going to be defiled with idols and their detestable things or any of their transgressions. God is going to save them from all the places where they've been living and sinning. And God is going to cleanse them so that they will be my people and I will be their God. So what we're seeing here is a type of with the reunion of Joseph to his brothers, a type of the same thing that's going to happen in a prophetic sense when there's a reunification of the northern and southern kingdoms in Israel during the Messianic reign. So we're actually looking at as a remez, if you will, a hint forward to that time that happened all the way back when at the time of Joseph, and yet looking ahead to the time when one day all of Israel would be brought together as one. So now we're going back just for a moment, and you should be able to get to your handout in a second here. Last week's Parsha, we talked about Pharaoh appointing Joseph as an administrator over all of Egypt, second in command. And Joseph had correctly interpreted, or rather, God correctly interpreted the dream about the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. By the time we get to the stage where Joseph is revealing himself to his brothers, we'd already gone through 2 years of the famine in Egypt. Now we're looking at another 5 more years. So we're seeing here that it's toward the, after the years of plenty, and now we've already had 2 years of famine, and now we've got 5 more years to go. Interestingly enough, a lot of historians think that this Pharaoh that made Joseph second in command was a Hyksos ruler. Now there are some that disagree. You're going to find in history, you got some folks that will agree and disagree. But around the year 1700 BCE, before the Common Era, what happened is a group of shepherd warriors came through and conquered Egypt. This would be in the Middle Kingdom. And they were the Hyksos people. And they successfully took over Egypt, had a succession of 6 kings, and that was known as the great Hyksos pharaohs. And that was written about even by Josephus Flavius, who was the Jewish historian of the 1st century. He wrote the book Antiquities of the Jews and identified the Hyksos with the Hebrews. Maybe, maybe not. But anyway, around 1560 BC then, the Hyksos were expelled in rebellion by the local indigenous population. And that marked the beginning of a new empire led by Egyptian rule. The Hyksos were either killed or expelled out, or they were enslaved. So the Egyptians became xenophobic, fear with no reason, and they wanted to make sure that this was not going to happen again, where they were ruled by another people. So here we see then the time frame is very, very close to that of the time where you see a king rising up in the book of Exodus, chapter 1, who knew not Joseph. So the kings that knew Joseph would have been the kings of the Hyksos, and the ones that didn't know Joseph would have been back in Egyptian rule again, and they didn't want anything to do with any of the Hebrews, or they didn't want anything to do with the Hyksos, which were shepherd warriors. Now, Joseph is about 30 years old when he starts, if we will call him, at the ministry. He's 30 years old when he starts to rule, and when he starts to collect the tithe of all the products that were produced for storage in preparation for the famine. So there's another typological hint, if you will, or foreshadowing, pointing toward Yeshua. Yeshua was sold by his brothers into the hands of the Gentiles, and right at this moment, to Jewish people, he looks like a Gentile. So as far as many Jews are concerned, Jesus is the Messiah for Gentiles, but he's certainly not the Messiah for Jews. But when you see Joseph revealing himself to his brothers, as far as Joseph's brothers were concerned, what did they think he was? An Egyptian ruler. Then when he reveals himself as, this is your brother Joseph, all of a sudden their eyes are open, they see Joseph, and they're thinking, oh boy, we're in trouble now. And isn't that going to be roughly the same thing that happens when Yeshua comes back? He's going to be revealing himself as a Jew. Because you see in the book of Revelation, he's still the Lion of Judah. Yes. You can't touch Revelation for sure. So Jesus is a Jew. And Jewish people are going to say, when he comes, because they're going to come to the place of discovery, the United States isn't going to be able to help them at all in this upcoming war. No. They can't rely upon the United States of America. I think that should be pretty evident by now. And when that's the case, then Jesus comes back, Yeshua comes back, reveals himself as a Jewish Messiah. And so we're seeing typological things all over. Jesus was about 30 years old when he started his ministry, so was Joseph. Interestingly enough, about Yeshua, he never sinned. Joseph has no sin recorded of him at all. There's another man in Scripture, Daniel, who didn't have a sin recorded about him either. Very rarely do you find it in Scripture where some sin isn't brought out about somebody, even if they're a faithful follower. And here Joseph, no sin, and Jesus, Yeshua, no sin. Last Shabbat I passed out a handout that had the parallels with Joseph and Jesus from a church, and it was really good, quite a few of them. Now we get into our topic today, and you should be right on track with me with your handout. The general overview, looking at the whole picture all at once in this week's Torah reading, Vayigash, Judah responds to Joseph's demand that Benjamin remain enslaved in Egypt. Of course, the goblet was in Benjamin's pack. And then Judah comes and says, well, take me instead. I'll be your slave. Joseph then reveals his identity to his brothers, and at Joseph's request, then Jacob and his family come down to Egypt. That's the overall. The first Aliyah, the person who'd come up to read first. In the end of last week's Torah reading, that's why I wanted it to be read by Phil, even though it wasn't within this week's Torah, reminding us that Joseph demanded that Benjamin, his other brother, through his mother Rachel. Rachel died, of course, near Bethlehem. Rachel died in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. She called him Ben-Oni, son of my sorrow, but no, instead the father said, no, his name will be Benjamin, which is son of my right hand. And then in our reading now, Benjamin was to remain behind because it was in his pack that the goblet was. We see then that Joseph then, in Genesis chapter 44, verse 18, we see now that Judah comes up, steps up to the plate, and he says, take me instead. The reason why is because he'd already seen 20 some odd years worth, 22 years worth of his father's sorrow at the loss of Joseph. And he didn't want to see his father die because of the loss of Benjamin. He knew that Jacob loved the youngest son. The second Aliyah is when Judah goes on, he says, when Jacob, my father, sees that the boy is gone, he will die. He explained to Joseph that Judah had taken personal responsibility that Benjamin would return unharmed to Canaan. And he did that to his father before they left with Benjamin. So as such, he asked to remain a slave instead of Benjamin. Now 22 years earlier, let's do a contrast. Go to Genesis chapter 37. It was a whole different story way back then. In Genesis chapter 37, it was actually Judah, in verse number 26, that says, what advantage is it to us because they had thought we'll kill him and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelim, if I could say it, Ishmaelites. Now, Ishmael was the firstborn son of Isaac through the servant Hagar. Now, Isaac was the secondborn. It's bad. Sorry. Let me try this again. Ishmael was the firstborn of Abraham through Sarah, her servant Hagar. I will get through this. I will. Then the secondborn was Isaac. And what we've got here then, the Ishmaelites were the ones that were buying, of course, Joseph. So it went into the hands of a relative, and these guys were pretty nomadic. So they went around through the desert, similarly to what we see the Bedouin doing today. And they go around trading. So what Judah is suggesting is, why don't we just sell him to the Ishmaelites, and then instead of killing him. And they decided to put him into a cistern because Reuben was planning on taking his brother out of the cistern and keeping him from anything bad. So we saw Judah then, back then, he proposed to sell his brother Joseph, the firstborn son, into slavery. Now he is willing, for the rest of his life, to place himself into slavery instead of his brother Benjamin, who was the second-born son of Rachel. What's happened over these 22 years? A change of heart. He's seeing what happened to his dad over these 22 years. He doesn't want to see his dad perish. So Judah's heart was changed. God is looking at our hearts. You know, at one time, I wasn't really a nice person. And I didn't do good speech, if you will, kind and clean language. And so the Lord has changed me a lot over those years since that time. The Lord can change us all if we let him. If we let him in, we let God do what he's going to do through circumstance. He did the same thing to Judah. Judah's heart changed, and he didn't want to see his dad hurt anymore. That point, Joseph reveals himself. He asked all the Egyptians to leave the room. Then he reveals his identity to his brothers and said, "I'm Joseph." Now what's really interesting is that what Judah had proposed years and years earlier, 22 years earlier, by selling his brother, was actually in the plan of God. Yeah. Because when God spoke to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, and we're going to get to it in a moment, he said, for 400 years, your descendants will live in a land that's not theirs. And there, they're going to become a great nation. Well, how is that going to be possible unless through God setting things up, like he did here? God sent Joseph ahead to preserve life, that God will be able to preserve the seed of Abraham, and therefore, this was the plan of God. We said this a couple Shabbats ago. Was Joseph ever out of the will of God when he was sold into slavery? No. Was he out of the will of God when he was in Potiphar's house? No. Was he out of the will of God when he was put into prison? No. What we're looking at here is this. Whatever tribulation and trials we will go through, we're not out of the will of God if we keep our eyes focused on him like Joseph did. Joseph could have, in that society and day of age, gotten away with having intercourse with Potiphar's wife. Yeah. But yet, he said that I can't do this because it would be sinning against who? Against God. So Joseph is keeping his eyes fixed upon God no matter what the circumstance is, no matter what the tribulation is. Joseph is keeping his eyes fixed upon God. When we go through our trials and tribulations, that's what God is looking for us to do. We're not going to probably be pulling out our Superman uniform and going and rescuing everybody in the world. Maybe not. But you see, neither did Joseph rescue everybody in the world, but those people that did have needs, like his brothers, like his father, like his family back home, like all the Egyptians that all the food was stored for, and even all the nations. But in order to get all those bennies or benefits, what did they have to do? They had to go there and get it. You see, we need to understand that God has all these blessings for us. We're not out of his will as long as we keep our eyes on him, and we need to pursue God. Not pursue the benefits. We need to pursue God. And in pursuing God, God is going to not only change us, but he's going to use us to be tools to work in the hearts of other people that he wants to bring to know him. Earlier I mentioned God doesn't hate the Palestinian people. God doesn't hate the Arabs. God loves the world, so he sent his only son. One of the hardest things I have to do is to be able to look kindly upon Palestinians because of what they've done. It's hard for me to do that. My instinct and my training leads me to want to do something else. And it's not to show kindness. What I need to do is realize that God may be very well using me as with you to be able to show kindness to other people so that maybe they could come to know God just like Wally Chubat did and just like others have done. And the Pastor Saeed, who's now in captivity in Iran, do you know why he's back there? So more of his people could get to know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. See, not all Iranians are bad either. God can use whatever tools he wants to bring them to him. The third aliyah, Joseph then directs his brothers to quickly return to Canaan and bring Jacob and their families back to Egypt, where Joseph promised to provide them with food until the famine ends. Still 5 more years of famine, remember. Joseph embraced his brothers and cried, and Pharaoh was informed that Joseph's family had arrived, and he too instructed them to come to Egypt, where he would give them the best of the land. So the brothers went back to Canaan, laden with gifts from Pharaoh, and Joseph informed Jacob that Joseph was alive. Indeed, he ruled over all of Egypt, and the spirit of their father Jacob was revived. The fourth aliyah, Genesis 46. Jacob and his entire family left Canaan and headed to Egypt. En route, they stopped at Beersheba, which means 7 wells, where God told Jacob not to fear going to Egypt, for it is there that he will be made into a great nation. Furthermore, God told him, I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up. Now later on, we're getting really close to Moses and the Exodus. And when God in the book of Exodus says, I have heard the cry of my people, God was down there, not only with Jacob, but with the Hebrew people. So when we get to the book of Exodus, God is going to say to Moses, Moses, I want you to go down to Egypt, and I want you to speak to Pharaoh. Tell him, let my people go. And it says then that God says, and I will bring my people back to this mountain. Moses probably thought, phew, no, I want you to go down and bring them back to this mountain. You see, it's easy enough to say to God, hey, you go ahead and do that, that's fine. When you get back here, I'll be happy to see you. But that's not how it works. God oftentimes uses us to do that work. Why is it that God doesn't just send angels all over the earth and convince people that Yeshua is the Messiah and they should all turn to him? Because he's got us. We're his shlachim. We're his ambassadors. We're his apostles to go out into the world and bring others to know him. God is going to do the work. He's going to use us. He's going to empower us to do that ministry. But God is going to be with us as we go through it. He's going to go down with Jacob to Egypt. He's going to bring Jacob and his descendants back up. Jacob first, he's going to be buried in the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron. After he dies, he's going to be there in Egypt for a little bit there. And then his body is going to be brought up to Hebron. So Israel, that's Jacob's new name, takes everything he owns with him on his journey. He arrives at Beersheba, offers sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac, and in a vision at night, God calls to him and says, Yaakov, Yaakov. And he answered, here am I. And he said, I'm God, the God of your father. Don't be afraid to go down to Egypt. It is there that I'll make you into a great nation. Not only will I go down with you to Egypt, but I'll bring you back here again after Joseph has closed your eyes. Now, in Genesis 15, which we talked about earlier, by the way, this is a very important one. And my brother, you remember when we walked through the pieces together some month or so ago? Wasn't it you, or was it the other Jason? I can't remember. Anyway, today I can't remember anything. Genesis 15. God made a covenant with Abram. And this covenant was for a land. And that land was promised to him and his descendants forever and ever. And in that day, the covenant-making process that was made was that one person making a covenant with another person would bring from the best of their flocks, the best of their birds, and they'd cut them up to create a path in the middle. And then they would walk together through that path and say, thus be it done to me as unto these, if I don't keep my end of the promise. Now, if somebody wanted to make an unconditional covenant with somebody else, let's say you and I, John, and I'm going to be the one that makes an unconditional one, you don't really have to do anything, I would walk through the pieces myself and say, so it be done unto me as unto these, if I don't keep it. Now, interestingly enough, when you look at Genesis chapter 15, you're going to notice that as the sun was about to set, verse 12, a deep sleep fell on Abram, horror and great darkness came over him, and Adonai said to Abram, know this for certain, your descendants will be foreigners in a land that's not theirs. They will be slaves and held in oppression for 400 years. But I will also judge that nation, the one that makes them slaves. And afterward they will leave with many possessions. As for you, you will join your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. Only in the 4th generation will your descendants come back here, because only then will the Amorite be ripe for punishment. After the sun had set, there was darkness, a smoking firepot, and a flaming torch appeared, which passed between these animal parts. That day Adonai made a covenant with Abram. I've given this land to your descendants from the valley of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, the territory of the Kenite, the Kenizzite, the Cadmonite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Rephaim, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. Now, who passed between the pieces of these dead birds and animals? The symbols of God. What was Abraham doing? He was sound asleep. So in this vision, he's asleep. He's not walking between the pieces. It is not up to him or his descendants to keep this covenant. What God is saying by the presence of two, by the way, there was a smoking firepot and a flaming torch. A covenant cannot be made without the witnesses of two. The presence of two establishes a thing. That's Torah. What God did was have the two symbols of his presence going between the pieces, and literally what God is saying is, if I don't keep this covenant with you, may it be unto me as unto these pieces. Now, in the Ur of the Chaldees, this is how covenants were made. And God is then saying that it's not upon you or your descendants for this covenant of the land. It's not upon you and your descendants' righteousness for the covenant of the land. It's up to me. God is sustaining and holding this. So whenever Israel gives away another inch of land or another couple miles of land or kilometers out there it is, they're not to be doing that. In fact, in the judgment of the nations, next Shabbat, I hope we can finish up on the day of the Lord thing, but on the judgment of the nations, two things God is going to judge the nations for. One is, how did they treat my people Israel? And the number two, they divided my land. Why did they do that? Those are the two things that the judgment at the Valley of Jehoshaphat are going to be. God is kind of torqued off about both. And he should be. So God is the one that sustains this. And he also made the prophecy to Abraham that your descendants will be foreigners in a land that's not theirs. So here is Beersheba right there. And this is where Jacob had stopped to do the sacrifices. There's Hebron. That's where the patriarchs are right now. So Beersheba all the way down to from Beersheba all the way down to the land of Goshen. So here's Joseph's family going to Goshen due to the famine. Now, here again is a thematic recapitulation where you get a theme repeated over and over again. You remember in the time of Abraham, there was a famine in the land, right? What did Abraham do? He went down to where? Egypt. Now, during the time of Isaac, there was a famine in the land. What did Isaac do? By the way, Isaac never left the land. He didn't leave the land to find a wife. Abraham sent Eleazar, his servant, up to Uncle Laban's place to find a wife for Isaac. And so Isaac stayed in the land even when there was a famine. Now Jacob, here again, here's another famine. A thematic recapitulation. So Abraham went to Egypt, Isaac didn't, and then Jacob went to Egypt. And there we see it was to Abraham that God said, for 400 years, your descendants will be in a land that's not theirs, and they will be slaves. It would be Jacob and his descendants, because now at the invite of Joseph, because there were still 5 years of famine left, then Jacob comes down to Mitzrayim, to Egypt. Now, the fifth Aliyah in Genesis 46, 26, and 27, if you wanted to look at it, is what appears to be is a error in the Bible. Now, you're always going to find people that are going to say, well, the Bible is full of errors. And this would be one of the places that they can say, oh, see, if the Bible is truly the Word of God, there shouldn't be these errors. And so what you see here in Genesis 46, 26, and 27, it says, all the people belonging to Yaakov coming into Egypt, his direct descendants, not counting Yaakov's sons' wives, totaled 66. And the sons of Joseph, born to him in Egypt, were 2. That makes 68. Thus all the people in Yaakov's family, you got to count Yaakov as well, and then you got to count Joseph, made 70. Because Joseph came down to Egypt too, you know. So you'll see it in the scripture where it says 70. And when Shebim, right here, or Shebim, that is the word 70 in Hebrew. But if you go to the book of Acts, you're going to see Stephen. And it was read today by Lynn. And Stephen, who's a Greek Jew, he goes ahead and says this, that Joseph then sent for his father Yaakov and all his relatives, 75 people. So you got 70 back in the Torah, now you got 75 by Stephen. And you get this thrown in your face. Because which one was it? Was it 70 according to the Torah or 75 people? So let's consider this. The speech is given by Stephen, who's a Greek Jew. We talked about Hellenistic Jews. We talked about Hellenistic Jews, you know, in the context of Alexander the Great. We talked about Hellenistic Jews in the context of Antiochus, Epiphanes, and Hanukkah. Stephen was one of them. And he was one of the deacons that were originally serving. So this passage in Acts 7:14 is a part of the speech that Stephen gives just before he dies. Now, your New Testament passages cite, as we talked about earlier when we were talking about hermeneutics and biblical interpretation, they cite the Septuagint, which is a translation. Has anybody heard the old phrase, something was lost in a translation? Yes. Well, in this case, something is lost in the translation. What gives? Why is it that in one place it's 70 and in another place it's 75? Well, there are possible explanations. But here, if you look at the Greek, and I wish your son-in-law were here, but if you go and look at the Septuagint, and if you go and look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, the scroll is 4Q, Q is meaning Qumran, it was found in Qumran, and EXOD, meaning Exodus, and it varies from what we saw in the Hebrew in Genesis 46:27, and also, by the way, in Exodus 1:5, where it still says 70. And we see then that the Septuagint says 75. And when you look over here at the last two words here, Penta, P-E-N-T-E, Penta. Now we know that by the word Pentecost, right? Yeah. Where it's 50 days, that's a derivative of 5, where it's 50 days after Passover. Well, Penta means 5. So now you've got 75 in the Septuagint. Now the Septuagint was a rabbi translation. 72 rabbis took the Hebrew of the Torah and translated it into Hellenistic, language, which is Koine Greek. So why is it that the Septuagint said 75 when the rabbis should very well have known that it was just 70? Well, there is a way to explain it, and that is this. The trip all the way from the land of Canaan all the way down took a little bit of time. Right? 5 could have very well been born. 5 were probably in the basket, and they could very well have been born. That's a phrase here. They could very well have been born along the way. That's a very good possibility. Another thing is, it could just simply be, terminology where, somebody might have made a grammatical error or something like that and brought that in. I prefer to think some kids were born, and that would have done it. Anyway, I don't believe that the Bible is an error. I don't think that that's true. So I believe that there were 70, and my interpretation would be that the 5 would have been, children being born along the way. So they could very well have been that way. The 6th Aliyah, almost done. Jacob arrives in Egypt to the province of Goshen that Pharaoh had allotted to his family. Joseph went there to greet his father. If we go to Genesis 46, 31 to 34, it says that Joseph prepared his family for a meeting of Pharaoh. Now this is really I find it a very interesting passage, because he is really just doing something. He's coaching his brothers and his father. And he's coaching them as to what to say when you come before the Pharaoh. Kind of like the same thing we would do as if we were invited to meet the president or the queen, better yet the Queen of England. Because the Queen of England, you do not touch her or approach her until she asks you to come. And if she touches you first or shakes your hand, then that's what you do. You don't come in front of her and do it on your own initiative. She has to invite you. Just like Esther. In order for Esther during Purim to approach the king, her husband, he had to put his scepter down toward her to invite her to come up. Otherwise, it would have been a ugly thing if he didn't want her to come. So royalty, we could treat it like that. So why is Joseph preparing his family for meeting the Pharaoh? Just to make sure they say the right things and do the right things. He instructs his brothers to tell Pharaoh that they are keepers of livestock. That's what he says. He doesn't go ahead and tell them to say, I'm a shepherd. Watch this. Joseph said to his brothers and his father's family, I'm going up to tell Pharaoh, I'll say to him, my father and my father's family who are in the land of Canaan have come to me. Now, Joseph can get away with this. He's second in command. The Pharaoh is very beholding to Joseph, because Joseph is literally saving his whole country. And so therefore he owes, if you will, Joseph. The men are shepherds and keepers of livestock. They have brought their flocks, their herds, and their possessions. Verse 33, now he's coaching his brothers. Now when Pharaoh summons you and asks, what's your occupation? Tell him, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth until now, both we and our ancestors. This will ensure that you will live in the land of Goshen, for any shepherd is abhorrent to the Egyptians. Wow. So shepherds were not looked upon kindly. Now, one of the reasons perhaps why is because, the oil from the lanolin from the shepherd's wool, probably didn't have the best of odors, but I can't say a cow smells any better. I was raised on a farm. I was raised with both. But the thing is, cows were looked at more of a stronger animal, and a sheep was looked at as a pretty dumb, weak animal. And maybe that's the reason why we're all called sheep. Yeah. But livestock is looked upon a little bit better. You see, why is it that a lot of nations have eagles as their bird for the national symbol and not a turkey, like Benjamin Franklin proposed ours would be a turkey? Really? Why don't we have a turkey? I don't know. They're not too smart. That's why. Joseph said to his brothers and his father's family, I'm going to go tell Pharaoh, I'll say to him, my brothers and my father's family who are in the land of Canaan have come to me. He can say this. They're shepherds and keepers of livestock. But they're to say, we're keepers of livestock, because a shepherd is abhorrent to the Egyptians. Back in Genesis 43:32, you'll note that when Joseph first had his brothers to dinner, they served him, Joseph, by himself, and the brothers by themselves, because Joseph was maintaining that he was still an Egyptian. The Egyptians included at the meal by themselves, so they were all separate. And the reason for that is Egyptians don't eat with Hebrews because that's abhorrent to them, because they're shepherds. So for whatever the reason was, being a shepherd was not a good thing when you were going down to the land of Egypt. So here the brothers really listened to the advice of their brother. Verse number 3. It says, Joseph took 5 of his brothers, presented them to the Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What's your occupation?" Right? That's what the Pharaoh was going to do. And they answered Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds." Both we and our ancestors. And they added, "We've come to live in the land because in the land of Canaan there's no place to pasture your servants' flocks. The famine is so severe there. Therefore, please let your servants live in the land of Goshen." Now, I'm sure that there might have been a little tense moment there, and Joseph was saying, "Why didn't you listen to me?" But you know, the good thing was, the land of Goshen. There's a land of Goshen that's in the Nile Delta, very fertile, even to today. This is a satellite photograph from NASA. Notice how beautiful and fertile it is. Now, of course, on the Nile River, along the banks, because it overflows regularly, there it is fertile as well. But then you'll notice that all the rest of the land is very parched. But Goshen is a perfect place for shepherds with sheep. Now the Pharaoh does respond, but he doesn't respond to them with what they just said. He responds to Joseph. Now Joseph, of course, is the second in command. He just heard, I'm sure, what Joseph's brothers said, which they weren't supposed to say. But he chooses to ignore it. I think that belies the fact that he's beholding then to Joseph for the survival of his own, of Pharaoh's own land. So Pharaoh says to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come before you, and the land of Egypt lies before you. Have your father and brothers live on the best property in the country, and let them live in the land of Goshen. Moreover, if you know that some of them are particularly competent, put them in charge of my livestock." So literally he ignores the shepherd part of it and chooses to respond to the livestock part of it. He addressed Joseph. He didn't respond to the thing about shepherds and flocks, since that's repulsive. Now, for all the blessings that Joseph, a descendant of Abraham, remember the original promise in Genesis chapter 5 that was given to Abraham. "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you." You'll notice that Potiphar was blessed in his household. It's because a descendant of Abraham was in there managing everything. You notice the head of the prison guard. He was blessed. And the reason why is because then a descendant of Abraham was blessed. That he blessed him, the Hebrew. Now the Pharaoh, the land was blessed because of Joseph. And so the blessing that Joseph and the descendants of Abraham bring allow others to be willing to overlook that which would be repulsive to their sensitivities. One more factor, very important one, in fact. And I like to close with things that apply to us, to put feet to the teaching that apply to us. The land of Goshen was literally separated. Notice Patan here, and Ramses here, and Cairo here, Memphis here, Thebes here. What you're dealing with here is where the Egyptians pretty well lived, and where their religious sacrifices and the rest of them occurred. And here's where Goshen is, up here, where all the nice green, lush grass and the rest of it is. The fact that the Pharaoh is separating off, and I believe this is the Lord's hand at work, the fact that the Pharaoh says, "Here's the land I want you to live in," was really a blessing to the descendants of Jacob. So over the next 400 years, roughly, what you're going to find is that the descendants of Jacob get to live in the land. They get the best of the land for their flocks. But that being where they are literally separated them from the majority of the population of the rest of Egypt.
What is going on with the majority of the population of the rest of Egypt? They were worshiping what? Their pagan gods. It's not like it's not rubbing off them. 400 years later, 430 some years later, here we are leaving Egypt, and now we're at the mountain, and what do our people build? A golden calf. Livestock. You see? There's a little bit of a tie there. They're following some of the religious practices of the Egyptians. So a little bit of Egypt rubbed off on Israel, but the separation helped to keep that from happening all the way. So it has a lot to do with the location. The land of Goshen. Location helped to separate the people of God from the rest of the pagans.